Egypt, 1945, a farmer's spade strikes a red clay jar sealed for 16 centuries. Inside, 13 leather-bound codices written in Coptic. Dust rises like incense. The words within whisper of a world before creation, before light. When God unseeing thought for the first time, her name was Barbelo, the first thought, the womb of the all, the mother of the living, but her name was erased, condemned as heresy, buried under centuries of silence. This is the story of how a forgotten idea, that God's first creation was not man, but a woman of light, was born, hunted, and rediscovered. A story written in ink and fire. A story that began with a single question. What if the first thought of God was love, and we destroyed it? Before there was light, before there was darkness, before there was anything that could be named or known, there was something that existed beyond all categories of existence. The ancient Gnostic texts call it the invisible spirit, the unknowable one, the boundless eon. It was not God as we understand the word today, not a being with intentions or desires, not a creator who stands separate from creation. It was pure potential, infinite and formless, dwelling in a silence so complete that even the concept of silent fails to capture it. Imagine a state before thought itself, before the first wave of consciousness rippled across the void. The Gnostic seers who recorded these visions in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era struggled with language itself, knowing that words could only gesture toward a what lay beyond all language. They wrote of the one who is before the beginning, of the spirit who dwells in inaccessible light, of the source that cannot be comprehended by any thought. This was not emptiness in any nihilistic sense. The pre-existent state described in texts like the Apocryphon of John and the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit was pregnant with infinite possibility. It was silence, yes, but the kind of silence that exists in the moment before a symphony begins, when the conductor's baton is raised and the entire universe of sound exists in potential, waiting to be born. The Greek philosophical tradition had wrestled with similar concepts. Plato spoke of the realm of forms, the eternal archetypes that existed beyond the material world. Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century, would describe the one, the ultimate principle from which all reality emanates. But the Gnostics added something radical to this philosophical heritage. They insisted that this ultimate reality possessed something like awareness, something like the capacity for self-reflection, and that this capacity would give birth to everything that followed. In the cosmology preserved in the Nag Hammadi texts, the invisible spirit existed in perfect unity, perfect stillness. There was no time, for time requires change, and there was no space, for space requires extension. There was only the infinite presence of the unknowable, dwelling in itself, complete and sufficient unto itself. But within this absolute unity, something stirred. Not a disruption, not a violation of the silence, but rather the first expression of what the silence had always contained. The invisible spirit, dwelling in its own infinite depths, became aware of itself. And in that moment of self-awareness, in that first act of divine consciousness, recognizing its own existence, the entire cosmos began to unfold. This was Barbelo, the first thought, the first emanation, the beginning of all that would follow. The name itself carries layers of meaning that scholars have debated for centuries. Barbelo may derive from Hebrew roots, Bar meaning son or daughter, and El meaning God. She is the child of God, but more than that, she is God's own self-awareness, the moment when the infinite becomes conscious of its own infinity. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most important Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, describes her emergence with breathtaking poetry. She became the womb of the all, for it is she who is prior to them all, the Mother-Father, the first human, the Holy Spirit, the thrice male, the thrice powerful, the thrice named, the androgynous one, the eternal aeon among the invisible beings, the first to come forth. Think of a mirror held up to infinity. What reflects back is not something separate from infinity, but infinity becoming aware of itself. Barbelo is that reflection, that moment of recognition. She is not created in the sense that we understand creation, as if God reached out and fashioned something external to himself. Rather, she is the invisible spirit's own self-knowledge, the divine mind perceiving its own depths. The philosophical sophistication of this concept is remarkable. 2,000 years before modern discussions of consciousness and self-awareness, the Gnostic teachers were grappling with questions that still perplex us. How does awareness arise? What is the relationship between the knower and the known? Can consciousness exist without an object of consciousness? Their answer was Barbelo. She is both the subject and the object of divine awareness, the eye that sees and the image that is seen, united in a single act of perception. In her, the ultimate paradox of existence finds its first resolution. Unity becomes multiplicity, without ceasing to be unity. The one remains one, yet knows itself as two. The text continues. She requested from the invisible virginal spirit, that is Barbelo, to give her foreknowledge, and the spirit consented. And when it had consented, foreknowledge came forth, and it stood by forethought. It is that which came forth from the thought of the invisible virginal spirit. It glorified him in his perfect power, Barbelo, for it was because of her that it had come into being. Here we see the beginning of what the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness, the divine realm of light and consciousness. Barbelo is not alone. From her, with the consent and participation of the invisible spirit, other divine powers begin to emerge. Foreknowledge, incorruptibility, eternal life. Each is an aspect of divine consciousness, a facet of the infinite reflected into being. The early Christian community in Alexandria, where these ideas first flourished, was a remarkable intellectual crucible. Jewish scholars studied Torah alongside Platonic philosophy. Egyptian priests maintained their ancient wisdom traditions even as the Greek language and culture dominated the city. Christian teachers debated the nature of Christ and the meaning of his teachings with a freedom and creativity that would soon be suppressed by orthodoxy. In this environment, thinkers like Valentinus and Basilides developed cosmologies of extraordinary complexity and beauty. They saw no contradiction between being followers of Jesus and exploring the deepest mysteries of existence. Indeed, they believed that Christ himself had come to restore the knowledge of these divine realities, to awaken humanity to its true origin in the light of Barbelo. Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who lived in the 1st century, had already prepared the ground for these ideas. He wrote extensively about the Logos, the divine word or reason through which God creates and orders the cosmos. For Philo, the Logos was both God's instrument of creation and the pattern or blueprint for all created things. The Gnostics took this concept further, seeing in Barbelo not just an instrument or pattern, but the very consciousness of God made manifest. The difference is subtle but profound. The Logos, as Philo and later Orthodox Christianity would understand it, is something God uses to create. Barbelo, in the Gnostic vision, is God knowing himself, and from that self-knowledge, all creation flows naturally, necessarily, like light radiating from the sun. This is not creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, as Orthodox theology would later insist. This is emanation, the unfolding of what already exists in potential, the blossoming of consciousness into its infinite expressions. Each emanation remains connected to its source, just as each ray of light remains part of the sun that generates it. The divine realm described in the Gnostic texts is not chaotic or arbitrary. It has structure, order, hierarchy, what the texts call the system of aeons. Barbelo, as the first thought, stands at the head of this hierarchy, but she is not alone. From her proceed other divine powers, each representing an aspect of the divine nature. The Apocryphon of John describes the process with mathematical precision. From Barbelo come 5 primary powers: foreknowledge, prognosis, indestructibility, aphtharsia, eternal life, aionios zoe, truth, aletheia, and the perfect human, autogenes or Christ. These are not separate beings, but rather aspects of the divine consciousness, ways in which the invisible spirit knows and expresses itself. Each of these powers exists in a relationship of mutual glorification with the source. They praise the invisible spirit, and in that praise they participate in the divine nature. They are light from light, truth from truth, life from life. The text emphasizes repeatedly that nothing comes into being through separation or diminution. The invisible spirit loses nothing by emanating these powers. Rather, it becomes more fully itself through their existence. Think of it as the architecture of mind itself. When you become aware of something, your consciousness doesn't split into pieces. Rather, it expands to encompass the new object of awareness while remaining whole. You are still yourself, but you are yourself knowing this thing. The Gnostic cosmology applies this principle at the cosmic scale. God becomes God knowing himself through Barbelo, and that act of knowledge generates further knowledge, further awareness, further light. The autogenes, the self-generated or perfect human, hold special importance in this hierarchy. This is Christ, but not as Orthodox Christianity would come to define him, not as the second person of a Trinity, not as God become flesh at a particular moment in human history. Rather, the autogenes is the eternal pattern of perfect humanity, the divine blueprint that exists before any human being walks the earth. The text describes 4 great luminaries that attend upon the autogenes: Harmazel, Aroyael, Devathai, and Elilith. Each of these luminaries rules over a realm of the pleroma, and with each are associated specific powers and virtues. Harmazel is accompanied by grace, truth, and form, Aroyael by perception, memory, and understanding, Devathai by intelligence, love, and idea, Elilith by perfection, peace, and wisdom, Sophia. Here we can see the influence of Platonic philosophy transformed by the mystical vision. Plato had taught that the material world was a shadow or reflection of eternal forms, perfect archetypes that existed in a transcendent realm. The Gnostics accepted the basic framework, but populated it with biblical figures and Christian symbolism. The forms become eons, personified powers dwelling in the presence of God. The system is elaborate, perhaps bewilderingly so to modern readers, but its complexity serves a purpose. The Gnostic teachers were trying to map the structure of consciousness itself, to describe how the one becomes many while remaining one, how unity differentiates itself into multiplicity without losing its essential unity. Each aeon represents a stable state of divine being, a perfect expression of some aspect of the divine nature. Together they form what the texts call the pleroma, literally fullness in Greek. The pleroma is the totality of divine reality, the complete expression of God's nature, the realm of perfect light and knowledge. But here, at the very apex of perfection, the seeds of tragedy are already present. The text hint at it with careful language. Each emanation, while remaining connected to the source, is also a step away from it. Each reflection, however perfect, introduces the possibility of distortion. Each thought, however pure, contains the potential for error. The Apocryphon of John describes the inhabitants of the pleroma as dwelling in rest and perfect glory. They are complete, needing nothing, desiring nothing beyond what they are. But the text also mentions that they are organized in ranks, in hierarchies. Some are closer to the source, others are further away, and in that distance, however small, lies the possibility of something going wrong. The last of the eons to be emanated is Sophia, wisdom. She dwells in the realm of Elilith, the 4th luminary, at the very edge of the pleroma. She is perfect, as all the aeons are perfect, but she is also the furthest from the original source, the last link in the chain of divine emanation, and in her, the first crack in the cosmic order will appear, but that comes later. For now, in this moment that exists outside of time, the pleroma is complete and perfect. Barbelo dwells in the presence of the invisible spirit, radiating light and knowledge. The eons sing their eternal hymn of praise. The four luminaries shine with undiminished brilliance. Everything is as it should be, as it has always been, as it will always be in the realm beyond time. The texts pause here in this moment of perfect stillness before describing what comes next. It's as if the ancient authors wanted their readers to contemplate this vision of ultimate reality, to let it sink into their consciousness before moving on to the story of how this perfection became the flawed material world we inhabit. In the Gnostic vision, this is not just ancient history or mythological fancy. This is the structure of reality itself, the eternal architecture of being. Barbelo and the aeons are not distant abstract entities. They are the very ground of consciousness, the light that makes all knowing possible, the life that animates all living things. To know Barbelo is to know yourself at the deepest level, because you are not separate from this divine reality. You are a spark of the same light, a fragment of the same consciousness, temporarily dwelling in matter but eternally rooted in the pleroma. The material world is a veil, a distortion, a forgetting, but not an absolute separation. The connection remains, however obscured, waiting to be remembered. In the perfect architecture of the pleroma, Sophia occupies a unique and precarious position. Her name means wisdom, and she is the last of the great eons to be emanated from the divine source. She dwells in the realm of the fourth luminary, Eleleth, at the very boundary of the divine realm. Here, at the edge of fullness, something unprecedented occurs, something the texts variously describe as an error, a passion, a fall, or a deficiency. The story exists in several versions across different Gnostic texts, each with its own nuances and theological implications. The Apocryphon of John presents perhaps the most detailed account, though similar narratives appear in On the Origin of the World, the Hypostasis of the Archons, and Pistis Sophia. Despite their variations, all versions share a common core. Sophia attempts to create without her consort, without the participation of the invisible spirit, and the result is catastrophic. What drove her to this act? The texts offer different explanations, none entirely satisfactory, all rich with implication. Some say she was overcome by love for the Father, desiring to produce something that would glorify him. Others suggest she wanted to create independently, to exercise her own creative power without seeking permission or collaboration. Still others hint at something like cosmic loneliness, a desire for her own counterpart, her own reflection. Whatever her motivation, Sophia stretched forth without the consent of the spirit and without her consort. The language here is crucial. All previous emanations in the pleroma occurred through paired activity, through the harmonious cooperation of complementary powers. Male and female, active and passive, knower and known, these polarities work together to produce new emanations that remain balanced and salable. Sophia's creation emerges from her alone, unpaired, unbalanced, and because it lacks the full participation of the divine source, it is fundamentally defective. The Apocryphon describes what emerges. She gave birth to a product which was imperfect and different from her appearance because she had created it without her consort, and it was not similar to the likeness of its mother, for it had another form. This product is the Demiurge, though he has many names in the Gnostic texts, Yaldabaoth, Saklas, Samael. He is described as having the form of a lion with the face of a serpent, his eyes blazing like lightning. He is immensely powerful, containing within himself some measure of the divine power that Sophia possessed. But he is also profoundly ignorant. Born outside the pleroma, separated from the source of light and knowledge, he has no awareness of the realm from which his mother came. Sophia's reaction to her creation is horror and shame. She perceives immediately that something has gone terribly wrong. She wants to hide what she has made, to conceal it from the other aeons, to pretend it never happened. The text says she cast it away from her, outside that place, that no one of the immortal ones might see it, for she had created it in ignorance. She places her creation in a cloud of light so that no one can see it except the Holy Spirit, the invisible force that sees all things. and then she names it Yaldabaoth, the blind god. Some scholars derive this name from Aramaic or Hebrew roots suggesting child of chaos or child of Sabaoth. Whatever its etymology, the name captures the essential nature of this being. He is a divine child born into ignorance, possessing power without wisdom, force without understanding. The tragedy of Sophia echoes through Gnostic thought with profound psychological and spiritual implications. She represents wisdom acting outside the bounds of proper wisdom, knowledge that has forgotten its source, the mind that believes it can create ex nihilo, from nothing, through its own power alone. Her error is fundamentally one of separation, the attempt to be whole while cut off from wholeness, to be complete while lacking completion. In the Valentinian version of the story, taught by the great Gnostic teacher Valentinus in 2nd century Rome, Sophia's passion is even more explicitly described as a kind of love affair gone wrong. She desires to comprehend the Father, to know the unknowable, to grasp the infinite with her finite understanding. This passionate desire separates her from her consort and leads to the birth of the demiurge. The psychological depth of this myth is extraordinary. Here we have a story about the dangers of desire, the perils of acting from passion rather than wisdom, despite being wisdom herself, the catastrophic consequences of separation from source. But it's not a moralistic tale about punishment for sin. Rather, it's a precise description of how ignorance and suffering enter into existence, not through willful evil, but through a kind of metaphysical mistake, an ontological error. Sophia's fall reverberates through the entire cosmos. Her deficiency creates a deficiency in the pleroma itself. The texts describe how the other aeons become aware of what has happened, how they mourn for Sophia, how they pray to the invisible spirit for her restoration. The perfect harmony of the divine realm has been disrupted. Something is missing. Something is out of place. The invisible spirit responds with mercy. Rather than condemning Sophia or rejecting her creation, the divine source works to restore balance and order. A limit is established, a boundary between the pleroma and what lies outside it. This boundary, called horos, limit, or cross, serves to protect the integrity of the divine realm, while also providing a way for what has fallen to be redeemed. Sophia herself is divided in some versions of the myth. Her higher part remains in the pleroma, restored to her proper place, while her lower part, sometimes called a kamoth, wisdom, in Hebrew, descends into the regions outside the divine fullness. This lower Sophia wanders in darkness and chaos, goes searching for the light she has lost, mourning for her separation from the source. Meanwhile, Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, surveys the realm into which he has been born. He sees only darkness and chaos, the formless void that exists outside the pleroma. He has no memory of the divine realm, no knowledge of Barbelo or the aeons, no awareness of the invisible spirit. And in his ignorance, he makes a fatal declaration, the first word spoken in the regions of darkness, the arrogant claim that will shape all that follows. I am God, he proclaims, and there is no other God beside me. This declaration echoes the words of the God of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures, but in the Gnostic context it becomes a statement of profound ignorance. Yaldabaoth believes himself to be the ultimate reality, the supreme power, the source of all things. He has no inkling that he is merely a shadow of a shadow, a defective copy of the true divine reality that exists beyond his comprehension. And yet, he possesses real power. He contains within himself a portion of the divine force that Sophia carried, even if he doesn't understand its nature or origin. With this power, he will create the material cosmos, our world, with all its beauty and all its suffering, its fleeting joys and its grinding anguish. Yaldabaoth does not create alone. From his own substance he generates powers called archons, rulers or authorities. The texts describe 12 primary archons, each governing a realm of the material cosmos, each carrying a name that sometimes echoes biblical angels or sometimes seems entirely foreign. Athoth, Hamas, Kalila-Umbri, Yabal, Adoniu, Cain, Abel, and others. These archons are described with vivid, often disturbing imagery: animal-headed beings, combinations of human and beast forms, entities whose very appearance speaks of the mixed nature of the material realm. They are neither purely good nor purely evil, neither entirely wise nor utterly foolish. Like their creator, they possess power but lack true knowledge. They can shape matter but cannot understand the spirit. Together, Yaldabaoth and his archons set about creating the cosmos. The Apocryphon of John describes this process in elaborate detail, presenting a Gnostic interpretation of the creation story in Genesis. But where Genesis describes the creation as good, the work of a benevolent deity, the Gnostic texts reveal the darker truth. This is the work of ignorant powers, a flawed imitation of the true divine creation that exists in the Pleroma. Yaldabaoth creates the heavens and the earth, but they are copies of the eternal aeons he has never seen. He organizes the planets and stars, but they are pale reflections of the four luminaries that shine in the divine realm. He shapes matter into forms, but these forms are imitations of the eternal forms that exist in perfect light. Everything in the material cosmos is a shadow, a copy, a diminished reflection of true reality. The creation reaches its culminating moment when Yaldabaoth and the Archons decide to make a human being. But even here, they are not acting from their own original vision. The text describes how a voice comes from the supreme power saying, "A human exists and the child of the human." And when Yaldabaoth looks up, he sees reflected in the waters below him the image of the perfect human, the Autogenes who dwells in the Pleroma. "Come," Yaldabaoth says to his Archons, "let us create a human being after the image of God and after our likeness." They create Adam, but their creation is initially lifeless, a psychic body without true animation. The Archons labour over this form, each contributing something from their own nature. One shapes the head, another the chest, others the limbs and organs. The result is a comprehensive map of human anatomy, each body part governed by a different Archon, each function of the body under the control of a different power. But Adam remains motionless, unable to rise. The Archons have the power to shape matter, but not to give life. True life, pneumatic life, spiritual life, can only come from the divine realm above. And here the text reveals a profound irony. The light that will animate humanity comes through Yaldabaoth himself, though he doesn't understand what he's doing. Sophia, watching from above, sees the plight of humanity. Though she has fallen, though she has erred, she retains her essential nature as wisdom. She appeals to the invisible spirit, asking for help to restore what was lost through her error. The spirit responds by sending forth a power that will indwell humanity, a spark of divine light that will be hidden within the material form. The text describes how this happens with cunning and subtlety. The divine powers cause Yaldabaoth to breathe into Adam's face, thinking he is merely giving animation to his creation. But in that breath, Yaldabaoth unwittingly transfers some of the divine power he received from his mother. The light of Sophia enters into Adam, and suddenly the human being rises, alive and radiant with an inner light. The Archons are amazed and terrified. Adam shines more brightly than they do. He possesses intelligence and wisdom beyond what they intended. Yaldabaoth realizes immediately that something has gone wrong, that in creating humanity, he has somehow diminished himself, transferred some of his own power and light into a creature meant to be his servant. Out of jealousy and fear, Yaldabaoth casts Adam down into the lowest region of matter, into the densest, darkest realm of physicality. The human being, bearing the spark of divine light within, is now trapped in a heavy material body, subject to the rule of the Archons, imprisoned in a world designed to keep him ignorant of his true nature. But the story doesn't end there. The text describes how a helper is sent, Eve, who emerges from Adam through divine intervention. In the Genesis account, Eve is created from Adam's rib to be his companion. In the Gnostic version, Eve is called the instructor, the life-giver, the one who will awaken Adam to the truth of his condition. The Archons see Eve's beauty and wisdom, and they desire to possess her for themselves, but she eludes them, leaving only a shadowy counterfeit while her true form ascends to safety. This shadow Eve is what the Archons defile, what they think they possess and control, but the true Eve, the spiritual Eve, remains free and becomes the instrument of humanity's awakening. The famous scene in the Garden of Eden receives radical reinterpretation in the Gnostic texts. The serpent in the garden is not the tempter, not the devil leading humanity astray. Rather, the serpent is the instructor in disguise, Christ the divine revealer, or Sophia herself in another form, who comes to awaken humanity from the sleep of ignorance. Why did God say you shall not eat from the tree of knowledge? The instructor asks Eve. The implication is clear. The prohibition against knowledge is not from the true God, but from Yaldabaoth, the jealous demiurge who wants to keep humanity ignorant and under his control. Knowledge, gnosis, is not the fall of humanity, but its salvation. The fruit of the tree represents awakening to the truth of one's divine origin. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree, their eyes are opened, not to their shame and nakedness as in the Orthodox reading, but to the reality of their situation. They see that they are not the creatures of this world, not the products of the demiurge's creation. They are sparks of divine light, fragments of the pleroma, temporarily trapped in matter, but not fundamentally of matter. Yaldabaoth's response is immediate and harsh. He curses the serpent, curses the ground, condemns Adam to labour and Eve to painful childbirth. But more than physical punishment, he attempts to reimpose forgetfulness. He creates sexual desire as a way to keep humanity distracted, focused on physical reproduction rather than spiritual awakening. He establishes the Hymermain, fate or destiny, a system of cosmic determinism governed by the movements of the planets and stars, each controlled by an archon. This is the world as we know it, a prison of flesh and fate, governed by ignorant powers, designed to keep humanity forgetful of its true nature. The material cosmos is not evil in itself, but it is a tragic mistake, a flawed copy, a realm of shadows and illusions. And yet within each human being burns that spark of divine light, that fragment of Barbelo's consciousness, waiting to be awakened, waiting to remember its true home. The texts emphasize repeatedly that matter itself is not evil, nor is the body inherently corrupt. The problem is ignorance, forgetfulness, identification with the material at the expense of the spiritual. Humanity's tragedy is not that we have bodies, but that we have forgotten we are more than our bodies. We have forgotten our mother, forgotten the light from which we came, forgotten that we are guests in this realm, not natives of it. In the Gnostic worldview, Eve becomes a figure of tremendous importance, not the cause of the fall, but the herald of awakening. She is called the mother of the living, and in some texts she is explicitly identified with Barbelo or with Sophia. Through her, the possibility of remembrance enters the world. Through her, knowledge becomes available to those trapped in ignorance. This radical revaluation of the Genesis story had profound implications for Gnostic communities. It meant that the God of the Old Testament, the jealous deity who demanded obedience and punishes disobedience, was not the ultimate God at all, but rather Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the blind ruler of this world. The serpent, cast as the villain in Orthodox Christianity, became a symbol of gnosis, of the Christ consciousness that seeks to liberate rather than enslave. And Barbelo, the first thought, the mother of the all, she remains present even in the depths of matter, even in the realm of forgetting. She is the light within the light, the consciousness that persists even when consciousness forgets itself. Every act of knowing, every moment of awareness, every instance of understanding is a return to His, a remembrance of the first thought of God. The story of Barbelo and the Gnostic cosmology did not emerge in a vacuum. It was born in one of the most extraordinary intellectual environments the ancient world ever produced, Alexandria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. This city, founded by Alexander the Great at the mouth of the Nile, had become the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, a place where cultures, religions, and philosophies that mingled and cross-pollinated with unprecedented freedom. The great library of Alexandria still stood, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Greek philosophers studied Plato and Aristotle. Jewish scholars pored over the Torah and developed elaborate interpretive traditions. Egyptian priests maintained their ancient mystery religions. And now, in the centuries following Jesus, a new religious movement was taking root. Christianity, still fluid and undefined, not yet hardened into orthodoxy. In this environment, teachers like Valentinus emerged. Born in Egypt around 100 CE, educated in Alexandria, Valentinus eventually travelled to Rome, where he taught a form of Christianity that would later be condemned as heretical, but in his own time was simply one option among many. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant teacher, a gifted poet, and a profound thinker. Some sources suggest he nearly became Bishop of Rome, a position that would later evolve into the papacy. Valentinus taught that Christ came not to redeem humanity from sin in the conventional sense, but to impart knowledge, gnosis, of humanity's true origin and destiny. He elaborated an intricate cosmology involving 30 aeons arranged in male-female pairs, emanating from the primal father and culminating in the drama of Sophia's fall and eventual restoration. His teachings were not meant to be recited as doctrine but contemplated as maps of inner experience, guides to the journey of the soul from ignorance to enlightenment. Basilides, another Alexandrian teacher roughly contemporary with Valentinus, developed his own complex system. He taught that the universe emerged through a series of emanations from an ineffable Father, and that Christ was not a physical being who died on the cross, but rather a spiritual power that descended upon Jesus of Nazareth and departed before the crucifixion. For Basilides, the physical suffering of Jesus was a kind of illusion or deception. What mattered was the spiritual reality, the transmission of gnosis. Carpocrates, yet another Alexandrian teacher, pushed Gnostic ideas in directions that scandalized even other Gnostics. He taught that the soul must experience everything in the material world before it can escape, leading to accusations, probably exaggerated or false, of ritual libertinism. Whatever the truth of these accusations, Carpocrates represents the radical edge of Gnostic thought, the willingness to question all conventional morality in pursuit of spiritual freedom. These teachers and others like them gathered students in homes, in rented halls, in rooms above the harbour, where ships from across the Mediterranean world brought news and goods and ideas. They conducted rituals that blended Christian baptism with mystery religion initiations. They passed down secret teachings, meant only for those who had been properly prepared. They wrote Gospels and Apocalypses and Revelations, texts that presented Jesus as a teacher of esoteric wisdom rather than a sacrifice for sin. The intellectual atmosphere was electric with possibility. Every night, in candlelit rooms scattered throughout the city, small groups gathered to discuss the nature of God, the origin of evil, the destiny of the soul. These weren't idle speculations, but urgent questions that touched the core of human existence. If God is good, why does the world contain so much suffering? If we are God's creation, why do we feel so alienated from the divine? If Christ came to save us, what exactly does salvation mean? The Gnostic teachers offered answers radically different from what would become Orthodox Christianity. They taught that the world's evil stemmed not from human sin, but from a cosmic error, a flaw in creation itself. They insisted that salvation came through knowledge rather than faith, through awakening rather than atonement. And they claimed that this knowledge had always been available to those ready to receive it, hidden in plain sight within the scriptures and teachings that everyone already knew. The diversity of Gnostic thought in this period is remarkable. Some groups emphasized asceticism, seeing the body and its desires as chains binding the spirit to matter. Others celebrated the body precisely because it housed the divine spark, making every physical act potentially sacred. Some saw Christ as the supreme revealer of gnosis. Others placed Barbelo at the centre of their devotion, addressing their prayers to the Mother of the All rather than to the Son. What united these various groups was their shared conviction that conventional religious authority, whether Jewish or Christian, had it wrong. The God worshipped in the synagogue and increasingly in the Christian assembly was not the ultimate God, but a lesser power, the demiurge, whose claim to be the only God was the very essence of ignorance. True religion meant seeing through this deception, recognizing the higher reality that lay beyond the creator of the material world. The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi preserve fragments of this vibrant, diverse movement. The Apocryphon of John, probably written in the 2nd century, presents a comprehensive Gnostic cosmology revealed by the risen Christ to the Apostle John. The Gospel of Thomas collects sayings attributed to Jesus, many of them enigmatic and paradoxical, emphasizing self-knowledge as the path to salvation. The Gospel of Philip explores the sacraments and relationships with subtlety and psychological depth. The Thunder Perfect Mind presents a female divine figure speaking in first-person paradoxes. I am the first and the last. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. These texts were not meant to replace the emerging Christian canon, but to supplement it, to provide the deeper meaning hidden within the surface narrative. The Gnostics didn't reject Genesis or the Gospels, they reinterpreted them. They saw themselves not as creating a new religion, but as preserving the true meaning of Christianity against those who would reduce it to a mere religion of faith and obedience. Barbelo appears repeatedly in these texts, always as a figure of supreme importance. In the Apocryphon of John, she is the first thought from whom all subsequent emanations flow. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, she is called the thrice-powered, 3 times named, the Mother-Father, the Virgin. In the 3 steles of Seth, she is invoked in ecstatic hymns of praise. You are one, you are one, you are one, O Barbelo, the Aeon of the Aeons, the eternal Aeon, the Virgin Spirit. The imagery associated with her is rich and multi-layered. She is the mirror of God, the womb of creation, the Virgin Mother. She is both masculine and feminine, containing all polarities within herself. She is pure light, pure consciousness, pure awareness. To know her is to know oneself, and to know oneself is to transcend the illusion of separation from the divine. The rituals practiced in Gnostic communities reflected these theological concepts. Baptism was understood not as a washing away of sin, but as an initiation into knowledge, a symbolic death to ignorance and rebirth into awareness. The Eucharist was not a sacrifice reenacted, but a communion with divine light, the physical elements serving as reminders of the spiritual reality they represented. Some communities practiced a 5-fold baptism, each stage representing a deeper level of initiation into the mysteries. The first baptism was of water, symbolizing purification. The second was of fire, representing illumination. The third was of spirit, bringing the initiate into direct contact with the divine pneuma. The fourth was of the redemption, signifying liberation from the powers of fate and the archons. The fifth and final baptism was into the pleroma itself, the fullness of divine reality. The bridal chamber sacrament, mentioned particularly in Valentinian texts, symbolized the reunion of the divided self, the heavenly spirit and the earthly soul coming together in sacred union. This was not a physical marriage, but a mystical one, the reintegration of what the fall into matter had separated. Some scholars speculate that it may have involved ritual actions between men and women. Others see it as entirely symbolic, an inner transformation rather than an outer ceremony. Prayer in Gnostic communities often involved direct address to Barbelo or to other figures of the pleroma. Rather than petitioning for worldly benefits or forgiveness of sins, these prayers sought illumination, knowledge, remembrance. They asked for awakening rather than salvation, for vision rather than mercy. The trimorphic protenoia preserves what may be fragments of such prayers. I am the thought that dwells in the light. I am the remembrance of the pleroma. I went into the realm of darkness. I endured until I entered the midst of the prison. The foundations of chaos trembled, and I hid because of the wickedness, and they did not recognize me. I came down a second time. I speak with the voice of light. I am the protenoia who dwell in the light. The sacred kiss, practiced by many Gnostic communities, was understood as a transfer of spirit between initiates, a sharing of the pneumatic light that each carried within. It scandalized outside observers who often accused Gnostics of sexual impropriety, but for the Gnostics themselves it was a holy act, a recognition of the divine spark in one another. All of this took place in an atmosphere of secrecy and selectivity. The Gnostics practiced what scholars call graduated revelation, different teachings for different levels of spiritual maturity. The uninitiated might hear simple parables and moral teachings. Those who showed promise would be introduced to more complex ideas. Only the fully initiated would receive the complete cosmological revelations, the full story of Barbelo and the pleroma, the detailed account of the soul's descent and potential return. This approach had practical as well as theological motivations. The authorities, both Jewish and increasingly Christian, looked with suspicion on groups that seemed to undermine established religious order. To teach openly that the God of the Bible was an ignorant creator rather than the supreme deity was to invite persecution. Better to speak in veiled language, to teach in parables, to reveal the mysteries gradually to those who proved themselves ready. By the early 3rd century, the Christian movement had spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. What had begun as a small Jewish sect centered in Palestine now encompassed diverse communities from Spain to Persia, from North Africa to Gaul. These communities varied wildly in their beliefs and practices. Some were largely Jewish in character, maintaining strict observance of Torah while believing Jesus was the Messiah. Others had fully broken with Judaism, seeing Christianity as an entirely new revelation. Some practiced strict asceticism, others celebrated the goodness of creation. Some emphasized faith, others knowledge. This diversity increasingly troubled certain leaders within the Christian movement. How could Christianity become a universal faith if different communities taught contradictory things about Christ, about God, about salvation? How could the Church maintain unity across the empire if every teacher could introduce novel ideas? The solution that emerged was the development of orthodoxy, right belief, enforced through institutional authority. The word heresy comes from the Greek heresis, meaning choice or school of thought. Originally it was a neutral term. To belong to a heresis simply meant you had chosen a particular philosophical or religious approach. But gradually Christian leaders began using the term pejoratively, to designate beliefs that departed from the emerging consensus about what Christianity should be. The battle lines formed around several key questions. Was Christ fully divine, fully human, or some mixture of both? Was the physical world created by the true God or by a lesser being? Did salvation come through faith alone, through works, or through secret knowledge? Was the God of the Old Testament the same as the God revealed by Jesus? These weren't abstract theological disputes, but fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the purpose of human existence. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in the late 2nd century, became orthodoxy's great defender and heresy's fiercest opponent. His massive work, Against Heresies, aimed to expose and refute what he saw as the corruptions introduced by Gnostic teachers. Written around 180 CE, it remains one of our most important sources for understanding Gnostic teachings, ironically preserved by its greatest critic. Irenaeus reserved particular venom for the Valentinians and for the cosmology centered on Barbelo. He ridiculed the elaborate emanation systems as absurd fabrications, mocked the idea that the true God could be unknown to the creator of the world, and condemned the Gnostic reinterpretation of Genesis as blasphemous. For Irenaeus, there was one God, the Creator, revealed in the Old Testament and incarnate in Jesus Christ. Any teaching that separated the Creator from the ultimate God was not Christianity at all, but a dangerous delusion. They maintain that the Barbelo spoken of by them is to be understood as the primitive aeon, Irenaeus wrote, dripping with contempt. But this aeon, being both male and female, produced from itself the father and mother. The mother is the Holy Spirit. How absurd! How contrary to Scripture! How can they claim to be Christians while denying that the creator of heaven and earth is the supreme God? What troubled Irenaeus and others like him wasn't just theological disagreement, but what they saw as Gnostic elitism. The Gnostics claimed to possess secret knowledge, hidden teachings that weren't available to ordinary believers. They divided humanity into categories: pneumatics who possessed the divine spark and could be saved through gnosis, psychics who might be saved through faith and good works, and hylics who were so bound to matter that salvation was impossible for them. This hierarchy seemed to undermine the universalist message of Christianity, that salvation was available to all who believed, regardless of social status, education, or spiritual sophistication. If gnosis was required for salvation, and gnosis was only available to a select few, then Christianity became an exclusivist mystery cult rather than a universal faith. Moreover, the Gnostic emphasis on knowledge over faith threatened the emerging institutional structure of the Church. If salvation came through direct mystical insight rather than through the sacraments administered by ordained clergy, then what role did bishops and priests serve? The Gnostic teacher, claiming to transmit ancient secret wisdom, competed with the ecclesiastical authority claiming to maintain apostolic succession. The battle was not only theological but also political and social. As Christianity spread, it increasingly attracted the attention of Roman authorities. Christians faced periodic persecution, most intensely under emperors like Decius and Diocletian in the 3rd century. To survive these persecutions, Christian communities needed unity, discipline, organization. They needed clear boundaries, ways to distinguish genuine Christians from frauds or infiltrators. The diversity represented by Gnosticism made such boundaries impossible to maintain. Tertullian, the brilliant North African theologian writing at the turn of the 3rd century, articulated the emerging orthodox position with fierce clarity. He insisted on a rule of faith, a basic creed that all Christians must accept. This rule stated that God the Father created the world, that Jesus Christ was his Son who became human, died, and rose from the dead, and that salvation came through faith in Christ and participation in the Church's sacraments. Anything that contradicted this rule, no matter how spiritually sophisticated or philosophically elegant, was heresy. "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Tertullian famously asked, dismissing the philosophical speculation that characterized Gnostic thought. What has the Academy to do with the Church? What have heretics to do with Christians? Our principles come from the porch of Solomon, who himself taught that one should seek the Lord in simplicity of heart. Away with all attempts to produce a Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic Christianity. We want no curious disputation after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. This anti-intellectual strain in emerging orthodoxy was significant. While Gnostic teachers engaged deeply with philosophical questions and welcomed complexity, Orthodox leaders increasingly emphasized simple faith and obedience to ecclesiastical authority. The mysteries of existence were not to be probed but accepted. Scripture was to be read according to the Church's interpretation, not according to individual insight. The institutional consolidation accelerated in the 4th century after Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the subsequent establishment of Christianity as the empire's official religion. What had been a persecuted minority became the dominant power, and with that power came the ability to enforce doctrinal uniformity through means far more effective than argument and persuasion. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE marks a crucial turning point. Convened by Constantine himself, the council brought together bishops from across the empire to settle disputes about Christ's nature, specifically whether Christ was of the same substance, homoousios, as the Father or merely similar, homoousios. The decision in favour of homoousios established the foundation of Trinitarian orthodoxy and set a precedent for resolving theological disputes through conciliar decree rather than through the free competition of ideas. While the Council of Nicaea didn't directly address Gnosticism, most Gnostic groups had already been marginalised by this point, its implications were clear. Christian belief would be defined by councils, enforced by bishops, and backed ultimately by imperial power. Alternative interpretations, alternative cosmologies, alternative approaches to Christianity would not be tolerated. The establishment of a biblical canon further constrained the diversity that had characterized early Christianity. By the late 4th century, church authorities had agreed on which texts should be considered authoritative scripture and which should be rejected. The 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were in. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John were out. The line between scripture and heresy was drawn with institutional ink. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, wrote his famous Easter letter in 367 CE, listing the 27 books of the New Testament that Christians should accept and warning against all other texts. "Let no one add to these," he wrote. "Let nothing be taken away. These alone are the springs of salvation, that whoever thirsts may be satisfied with the sayings in them. In these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness." This canonical closure had profound consequences. For Orthodox Christians, the story was complete. The scriptures they possessed contained everything necessary for salvation. Revelation had ended with the apostles. Anyone claiming new revelations or secret teachings was either deluded or deceptive. The cosmos worked the way Genesis described it. Salvation came the way Paul described it. Christ was who the canonical Gospels said he was. End of discussion. For Gnostics, this closure meant exclusion. Their texts were not just different, they were illegitimate. Their teachings were not just alternative, they were false. Their rituals were not just distinct, they were perverse. The institutional church had spoken and its message was clear. Conform or be condemned. The marginalization of Gnostic communities didn't happen overnight. Throughout the 3rd and into the 4th century, Gnostic teachers continued to operate, though increasingly on the fringes of Christian life. Valentinian communities persisted in Rome, Alexandria, and other major cities. Followers of Basilides maintained their schools. Texts continued to be copied and circulated, albeit more secretly. But the trajectory was unmistakable. What had once been one option among many within a diverse Christian movement became a condemned heresy, its practitioners subject to excommunication, harassment, and eventually legal persecution. The mechanisms of exclusion were theological, social, and ultimately coercive. Theologically, Orthodox teachers hammered home the message that Gnostic ideas were not just wrong but dangerous. They led souls astray, offering false salvation through prideful knowledge rather than humble faith. The Gnostic God, the unknown Father beyond the Creator, was dismissed as a philosophical abstraction, a denial of the personal God who loved his creation enough to become part of it. Barbelo, the Divine Mother, was characterized as a perverse invention, a corruption of pure monotheism with pagan elements. Socially, Orthodox communities increasingly refused fellowship with known Gnostics. The practice of closed communion, allowing only baptized Orthodox Christians to participate in the Eucharist, helped define boundaries and enforce conformity. Those who held Gnostic beliefs found themselves excluded from Christian assemblies, cut off from the social networks that sustained community life in the ancient world. Economically, the professionalization of Christian ministry created new pressures toward conformity. As Christian communities grew larger and more institutionalized, they required full-time clergy who depended on the community for support. A teacher who deviated too far from orthodox teaching risked losing not just theological arguments, but also livelihood and social position. The Valentinian communities perhaps survived the longest precisely because they had initially tried to work within the emerging institutional church, rather than positioning themselves in opposition to it. Valentinus himself had aspired to be Bishop of Rome. His followers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries often participated in ordinary church life while maintaining their distinctive teachings and practices. They received baptism from Orthodox bishops, attended public worship, and only in private gatherings did they explore the deeper mysteries of the Pleroma and Barbelo. But this strategy of accommodation ultimately failed. By the late 3rd century, Valentinian Christianity was being actively suppressed wherever Orthodox bishops had authority. Texts were confiscated and burned. Teachers were denounced from the pulpit. Lay people were warned that association with Gnostics endangered their souls. The surviving Gnostic communities developed elaborate secrecy practices. Texts were hidden, buried in jars in the desert, concealed in walls or under floors. Teachings were transmitted orally rather than written down. Identifying symbols and passwords allowed initiates to recognize each other without revealing themselves to outsiders. The rituals through which Gnostics had celebrated their distinctive understanding of Christianity continued in this underground existence, but with growing adaptation to the hostile environment. The bridal chamber ceremony, always controversial, became more symbolic and less literal. The fivefold baptism was compressed or abbreviated. The ecstatic hymns to Barbelo were whispered rather than sung. Some Gnostic teachers fled to the edges of the empire, beyond the reach of Orthodox authorities. Evidence suggests Gnostic communities existed in Persia, in Armenia, perhaps even further east along the Silk Road. There, mixed with other religious traditions, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, local animisms, Gnostic ideas took new forms, influencing and being influenced by the diverse religious landscape of Asia. The most successful offshoot of Gnosticism, though scholars debate whether to classify it as Gnostic at all, was Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia. Mani taught a radical dualism between light and darkness, spirit and matter, and claimed that Jesus, Buddha, and Zoroaster were all prophets of the same truth. His religion spread astonishingly far and fast, establishing communities from North Africa to China. Though Orthodox Christians considered Manichaeism the worst of heresies, it survived for centuries, its last communities persisting into medieval times. But for the Christian Gnostics who honoured Barbelo as the first thought, the 4th and 5th centuries brought increasingly desperate circumstances. The conversion of Constantine made Christianity the favoured religion of the empire, but it was specifically Orthodox Christianity that received imperial support. Heretics, Arians, Donatists, Gnostics faced not just ecclesiastical censure but also imperial sanction. Laws were passed forbidding heretical worship. Properties were confiscated. Teachers were exiled. In some cases, particularly stubborn heretics were imprisoned or executed. The Roman state, which had once persecuted all Christians indiscriminately, now became the enforcer of Christian orthodoxy against Christian heretics. The irony was bitter. Gnostic teachers had survived 3 centuries of periodic persecution by Roman authorities who saw all Christians as threats to social order. They had maintained their communities through Decius's persecution in the 250s, through Diocletian's great persecution at the turn of the 4th century. They had preserved their texts and teachings through decades of uncertainty and danger. But they could not survive the systematic suppression that came once Christianity had imperial power and Orthodox leaders had both theological certainty and coercive force to impose it. What argument and persuasion couldn't accomplish, law and violence could. In Egypt, where Gnostic thought had particularly deep roots, monastic Christianity emerged in the 4th century as a powerful force for Orthodox belief. The Desert Fathers, Antony, Pachomius, Macarius and others, established communities of rigorous ascetic practice dedicated to orthodox faith and militant rejection of heresy. These monasteries became centres of manuscript production, copying orthodox texts while systematically excluding heretical ones. Pachomius, who established the first communal monastery in Egypt around 320 CE, wrote rules that forbade his monks from reading heretical texts or associating with heretics. Shenut, abbot of the White Monastery in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, was notorious for his violent campaigns against pagans and heretics alike. He led raids on pagan temples and the homes of suspected heretics, destroying artifacts and manuscripts. It was probably from Shenut's campaigns or similar orthodox violence that the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were fleeing when they were buried sometime in the 4th century. Monks at a nearby monastery, perhaps themselves sympathetic to Gnostic ideas, or perhaps simply wanting to preserve texts they recognised as ancient and significant, sealed the codices in a jar and buried them in the cliffs near Nag Hammadi, where they would remain hidden for 600 years. By the end of the 5th century, Gnostic Christianity as an organised movement had effectively ceased to exist within the Roman Empire. The last known Gnostic communities disappeared from the historical record. The texts were lost, hidden, or destroyed. The teachers were dead, converted to orthodoxy, or silent. Barbelo's name was no longer spoken in Christian worship or prayer. For the Orthodox victors, this was as it should be. Heresy had been defeated, error corrected, truth established. The Church was unified under proper episcopal authority, its doctrines clearly defined, its scriptures fixed. The long and messy process of creating orthodoxy out of diversity was essentially complete, but something had been lost. A way of thinking about God, about creation, about the relationship between spirit and matter, about the nature of knowledge and salvation. The Gnostic vision, for all its complexity and strangeness, had offered a powerful response to the problem of evil. The world's suffering was not God's will, but a cosmic error, not punishment but prison, not something to be accepted but something to be transcended. The feminine divine embodied in Barbelo had offered a counterbalance to the increasingly masculine theology of orthodoxy. God as mother as well as father, as womb as well as source, as nurturing presence as well as commanding authority. These images receded from Christian consciousness, surviving only in marginal devotion to Mary or in half-forgotten metaphors. The emphasis on knowledge, on the transformative power of understanding one's true nature, gave way to emphasis on faith and obedience. The Gnostic confidence that salvation was available through direct insight into reality itself was replaced by dependency on institutional mediation, on sacraments, on clergy, on the Church's authority to bind and loose. The last Gnostic teacher in Alexandria, or Rome, or wherever the final community persisted, must have known they were witnessing the end of something precious. Perhaps they consoled themselves with the thought that truth cannot be permanently suppressed, that what is genuine will eventually resurface, that the light of gnosis cannot be entirely extinguished. Or perhaps they despaired, seeing centuries of wisdom about to vanish, seeing the name of Barbelo about to be forgotten, seeing the rich complexity of Gnostic thought about to be reduced to caricature and condemnation in the writings of its opponents. The texts they buried, if indeed they buried them deliberately, rather than simply losing track of them in the chaos of suppression, became a kind of time capsule, a message in a bottle cast into the future. These teachers couldn't know when or if the texts would be found again. They couldn't know whether anyone would still care about Barbelo, about the pleroma, about the divine spark hidden in humanity. All they could do was preserve what they could preserve, hide what they could hide, and hope that someday, somewhere, someone would unearth these texts and hear in them an echo of the truth they had known, the truth that human beings are more than flesh, that the material world is not ultimate reality, that knowledge itself is a form of salvation. As the jar was sealed and buried in the Egyptian cliff, as the last Gnostic hymns fell silent, as Barbelo's name ceased to be spoken, a long darkness descended. For 16 centuries, the Gnostic vision would exist only in fragments, in distorted accounts from hostile sources, in occasional hints and echoes in other mystical traditions. The institutional church had won, orthodoxy had triumphed. The story was settled. One God who created the world good, humanity that fell through sin, Christ who died for redemption, salvation through faith and sacraments. Any other telling was heresy, any other vision false. But in the desert, in the dry heat that preserves rather than destroys, 13 leather-bound codices waited. Barbelo waited. The first thought, buried but not destroyed, forgotten but not erased, waited for the day when someone would dig in the right place at the right time with the right questions in mind. December 1945. The Second World War had just ended, but Egypt was still occupied by British forces, and political tension simmered beneath the surface of daily life. In the region of Upper Egypt, near the town of Nag Hammadi, life continued as it had for centuries. Farmers tended their fields along the Nile. The desert stretched endlessly to the east, dotted with ancient cliffs and caves that had witnessed the passage of pharaohs and prophets, Roman legions and Christian monks. Muhammad Ali al-Saman and his brothers were digging for sabach, a nitrogen-rich soil used as fertilizer, at the base of a cliff called the Jabal al-Tarif. It was hard, hot work, the kind of labour that had sustained rural Egyptian families since time immemorial. The brothers had no expectation of finding anything except the soft soil they could sell in town. Muhammad's mattock struck something hard. Not rock, rocks were common, but something that rang hollow, like pottery. The brothers cleared away the sand and discovered a red clay jar sealed and about 2 feet high. They hesitated. In local folklore, such jars sometimes contained jinns, spirits that might curse those who disturbed them, but the jar might also contain gold or other valuables. Greed overcame superstition. Muhammad smashed the jar with his mattock. No jinn emerged, no treasure glittered. Instead, the jar contained books, 13 leather-bound volumes, their pages made of papyrus covered with text in a language the brothers didn't recognize. Disappointed, they nearly left the books there. What use were old books to illiterate farmers? But Muhammad's mother used some of the loose pages to kindle her bread oven. The rest he brought home, not knowing he was carrying some of the most significant religious texts ever discovered, hidden for 16 centuries, preserved by Egypt's dry climate and sheer chance. What happened next is murky, pieced together from testimony and fragments. Muhammad Ali and his brothers were involved in a blood feud that month. His father had been murdered, and shortly after the discovery of the texts, Muhammad and his brothers killed the murderer in revenge, then cut out his heart and ate pieces of it, a ritual act meant to prevent the deceased from testifying in the afterlife. In the chaos surrounding these events, the codices were scattered. Muhammad gave some to a local priest for safekeeping. Others were sold to dealers in antiquities, who recognized their potential value if not their actual contents. The volumes began moving through the shadowy networks of the Egyptian antiquities market, a world of dealers, collectors, smugglers, and occasionally scholars, where authentic treasures mingled with clever forgeries. One codex ended up with a dealer in Cairo who showed it to Fokion J. Tanno, a Belgian antiquities dealer. Tanno recognized something of the text's significance and purchased it, but before he could sell it further, the Egyptian government nationalized his collection as part of efforts to stem the outflow of national treasures. This codex, now known as Codex Wen, ended up in the Coptic Museum in Cairo under the stewardship of its director Togo Mina. Other codices took different paths. Some were smuggled out of Egypt, appearing in antiquities markets in Europe and America. One turned up in a Swiss bank vault purchased by the Carl Jung Institute in Zurich. It would later be called the Jung Codex, though Jung himself was too ill to examine it before his death in 1961. The Egyptian Department of Antiquities began gathering up the scattered texts, eventually reuniting most of them in the Coptic Museum. But this was a slow process. hindered by bureaucracy, political instability, and the challenge of tracking down volumes that had been dispersed through illegal channels. The first scholars to examine the Nag Hammadi texts recognized immediately that they had something extraordinary. The codices were written in Coptic, the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, written with Greek letters plus a few signs from Demotic Egyptian. But the texts themselves were clearly translations from Greek originals, dating probably from the 2nd or 3rd century CE, even though the physical manuscripts were from the 4th century. Jean Dorès, a young French scholar, was among the first to study the texts systematically. In 1848, he published preliminary reports identifying some of the works: a Gospel of Thomas, an Apocryphon of John, a Gospel of Truth. These titles alone were sensational. Some of these texts had been mentioned by the ancient heresiologists like Irenaeus, but they were thought lost forever how they had surfaced, allowing scholars for the first time to read Gnostic texts directly rather than through the hostile summaries of their orthodox opponents. The academic world responded with a mixture of excitement and caution. Excitement because the text offered an unprecedented window into early Christian diversity in the religious world of the 1st century CE. Caution because the texts also threatened established narratives about Christian origins and development. For nearly 2,000 years, the story of early Christianity had been told from the perspective of the winners, the Orthodox Christians whose version of the faith became dominant. The heresiologists had portrayed Gnostics as corrupters of pure Christian truth, introducing foreign philosophical ideas and perverse doctrines into what had been a simple, pure faith. The Gnostics were the bad guys in the story, the deviants, the heretics. But now scholars could read what the Gnostics themselves wrote, and the picture that emerged was far more complex than the orthodox caricature. These were sophisticated thinkers wrestling with profound questions about the nature of God, the origin of evil, the meaning of salvation. Their texts showed extensive knowledge of Scripture and deep engagement with philosophical questions. Whatever one thought of their conclusions, these were serious religious thinkers, not frauds or fools. The slow pace of publication frustrated scholars worldwide. Political factors complicated access to the texts. Egypt had gained independence from Britain in 1822, but tensions between Egypt and Western powers remained high, particularly after the New 52 revolution that brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power. The Coptic Museum, understandably protective of its treasures, controlled access carefully. Henry Charles Pouec, a distinguished French scholar, led early efforts to organize systematic study of the texts. He assembled a team of scholars, primarily French and Egyptian, to prepare critical editions, but the work proceeded slowly. The manuscripts were fragile, written on papyrus that crumbled at touch. The Coptic language, though understood, was difficult, with many technical theological terms whose meanings could only be guessed at. Moreover, some scholars and church officials were uncomfortable with the text's contents. The Gnostic worldview challenged fundamental Christian doctrines, the goodness of creation, the unity of the Bible's God, the uniqueness of Christ's revelation. Making these texts widely available might confuse the faithful, might lead people astray, might resurrect ancient heresies better left buried. The Catholic Church's response was particularly ambivalent. On one hand, Catholic scholars like Pouec led the research effort. On the other hand, some church officials worried about the implications if the early church was this diverse, if what became orthodoxy was just one option among many, if Gnostics were not simply wrong but had their own coherent vision of Christianity. What did this say about the Church's claims to possess the one true faith? Gradually, painstakingly, translations began appearing in scholarly journals and books. Each new text added to the picture. The Apocryphon of John provided the most comprehensive account of Gnostic cosmology discovered to date, with its elaborate mythology of Barbelo, the Eons, Sophia's fall, and the Demiurge's creation. The Gospel of Thomas presented 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many familiar from the canonical Gospels, others entirely new and often enigmatic. The Gospel of Truth, possibly by Valentinus himself, offered a meditation on knowledge and error, ignorance, and enlightenment. Barbelo appeared repeatedly in multiple texts, confirming what scholars had suspected from the heresiologists' reports, that she was central to Gnostic thought. But now they could read the hymns addressed to her, the elaborate descriptions of her role in creation, the theological sophistication with which Gnostic teachers conceptualize the divine feminine. She is the first power which was before all of them, which came forth from his mind. She is the forethought of all, her light shines like his light. The perfect power which is the image of the invisible virginal spirit who is perfect. The language was strange, to modern ears shaped by Platonic philosophy and ancient cosmology. But beneath the unfamiliar terminology, scholars could discern powerful ideas about consciousness and self-awareness, about how the one becomes many, about the relationship between matter and spirit. James M. Robinson, an American scholar, eventually organised the international team that produced the first complete English translation of the Nag Hammadi Library. Published in 1277, over 30 years after the text's discovery, it made the texts available to scholars worldwide, and eventually to the general public. Robinson's introduction noted the revolutionary nature of the find. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices is one of the 20th century's major archaeological discoveries comparable to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, which were broadly consistent with known Jewish religious literature, the Nag Hammadi texts were genuinely revolutionary. They forced a complete reconsideration of Christian origins. Early Christianity, scholars realized, was far more diverse than anyone had imagined. What became orthodoxy was not inevitable, not the simple preservation of apostolic teaching, but the result of long theological battles and institutional consolidation. Among the many revelations of the Nag Hammadi texts, few were more striking than the prominence of feminine divine figures, particularly Barbelo. The text presented her not as a minor figure or heretical innovation, but as central to the divine reality itself, the womb of the All, the Mother-Father, the Holy Spirit, the thrice male, the thrice powerful, the thrice named. This discovery coincided with and catalyzed major shifts in religious and cultural thinking about gender and divinity. The women's movement of the 1960s and 70s had already begun questioning patriarchal structures in society and religion. Feminist theologians were challenging the exclusively masculine language used for God in Christian worship and theology. Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, published in 1973, argued that masculine God language was both theologically inadequate and socially harmful, reinforcing patriarchal power structures. Into this context came the Nag Hammadi texts with their vision of a feminine divine principle at the very origin of existence. Here was not just metaphor or symbol, but an elaborate theology that placed a female divine figure, Barbelo, as the first emanation of God, the one through whom all subsequent creation flowed. Elaine Pagels, a scholar who would become one of the most important interpreters of Gnosticism for general audiences, immediately grasped the significance. Her book The Gnostic Gospels, published in 1979, brought Gnostic texts to widespread popular attention. Pagels argued that the suppression of Gnosticism was not merely about theological disagreement, but also about power, specifically about who could exercise authority in Christian communities. Gnostic groups, Pagels noted, often allowed women to serve as teachers, prophets, and leaders. Some Gnostic texts described apostolic authority passing through Mary Magdalene, as well as male apostles. The feminine divine imagery in Gnostic theology correlated with greater actual participation by women in religious leadership. When orthodoxy triumphed over Gnosticism, one consequence was the marginalization of women in church leadership and the erasure of feminine divine imagery. The God of Israel is masculine, Pagels wrote. The priests and prophets were men. The patriarchs were founding fathers. In the New Testament, the 12 disciples were all male. Jesus addresses God as Father, but the Gnostics imagine the divine differently, as including, even originating from, the feminine principle. Pagels quoted the Thunder Perfect Mind, a remarkable text from Nag Hammadi, in which a feminine divine figure speaks. I am the first and the last. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the silence that is incomprehensible. I am the utterance of my name. This text, like the Barbelo hymns, presented the feminine divine not as subordinate to the masculine, but as encompassing all polarities, all opposites. She is not just mother, but also father. Not just receptive, but also active. Not just creation, but also creator. Karen King, another important scholar of Gnosticism and Christian origins, built on Pagel's work with detailed studies of specific texts and themes. Her book The Gospel of Mary of Magdala examined a Gnostic text in which Mary Magdalene receives special revelation from Jesus and teaches the other disciples only to be challenged by Peter, who refuses to believe Jesus would give such authority to a woman. This text, King argued, preserved memory of early Christian debates about women's leadership. The Gnostic communities that produced and used such texts affirmed women's authority to teach and lead. The eventual Orthodox consensus, reflected in texts like 1 Timothy, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man," rejected that authority. The recovery of Barbelo and the Gnostic feminine divine had profound implications beyond scholarship. Religious feminists saw in these texts evidence that Christianity had not always been as patriarchal as it became. The feminine divine was not alien to Christianity, but had been part of its earliest expressions, only later suppressed. New religious movements drew inspiration from Gnostic ideas. Some contemporary goddess movements incorporated Barbelo into their pantheons. Feminist theology began experimenting with feminine god language, calling God Mother, as well as Father, speaking of divine wisdom, Sophia, as a feminine principle, reclaiming Mary Magdalene as apostle and teacher. The Catholic Church, interestingly, showed some openness to discussion of feminine divine imagery, though within careful limits. Pope John Paul I briefly suggested that God might be called Mother as well as Father, though he died before developing this idea further. Theologians wrote about the feminine aspects of the Holy Spirit, or about divine wisdom as a bridge between masculine and feminine imagery, but mainstream Christianity remained cautious. Too much emphasis on the feminine divine risked, in the view of Orthodox theologians, introducing pagan goddess worship into Christianity or undermining biblical monotheism. Barbelo, for all her newly recovered prominence in scholarly discussion, remained marginal to actual Christian worship and theology. Still, the shift in consciousness was real and significant. After Nag Hammadi, no serious scholar could claim that patriarchal God language was the only option in early Christianity. The texts proved that Christians in the first centuries had imagined divine reality in more complex, more balanced, more feminine inclusive ways. That this vision had been suppressed was undeniable. Whether it should now be recovered remained a matter of heated debate. Beyond specifically religious contexts, Barbelo became a symbol of recovered feminine wisdom, of the divine feminine that patriarchal culture had tried to erase. Artists, writers, and spiritual seekers who might never read the actual Gnostic texts still absorbed something of their essence, the idea that consciousness itself might be fundamentally feminine, that the first thought of God could be a goddess, that creation emerged from a womb as well as from a word. Carl Jung never saw the Nag Hammadi texts. He died in 1961, while most of the manuscripts were still unpublished, still locked in the Coptic Museum or scattered in private collections. But Jung had discovered Gnosticism decades earlier, and it shaped his entire psychological system in ways both obvious and subtle. As a young psychiatrist working at the Burg-Holzli Hospital in Zurich. In the early 1900s, Jung encountered patients whose psychotic delusions contained elaborate mythological systems. They spoke of cosmic struggles between light and darkness, of divine sparks trapped in matter, of secret knowledge that would liberate the spirit. Jung initially dismissed these as pathological fantasies, symptoms of diseased minds. But as he studied the history of religion and philosophy, Jung began recognizing in his patients' delusions echoes of ancient Gnostic ideas. The similarities were too detailed, too specific to be coincidental. Yet his patients had no knowledge of Gnosticism. Most had never heard the word. How could they be reproducing Gnostic cosmologies in their psychotic states? Jung's answer would revolutionize depth psychology. He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, the repository of repressed personal memories and conflicts, lay a collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche shared by all humanity. This collective unconscious contained archetypes, universal patterns, and images that appeared across cultures and throughout history. The Gnostic myths Jung realized were not merely ancient theology, but maps of the psyche itself. Barbelo was an archetype of the divine feminine, of the self-aware consciousness that emerges from the unknown. The pleroma represented the totality of the psyche, the fullness of human potential. Sophia's fall dramatized the ego's separation from the unconscious. The demiurge embodied the ego's delusion of absolute authority, its identification with consciousness, while remaining ignorant of the unconscious depths. In 1916, during a period of intense psychological crisis, Jung experienced what he later called his confrontations with the unconscious. He actively engaged his own unconscious through a technique he called active imagination, allowing images and figures from the depths to emerge into consciousness. During this time, he wrote a mysterious text called 7 Sermons to the Dead, attributed to Basilides of Alexandria, the 2nd century Gnostic teacher. The sermons present a Gnostic-style cosmology, beginning with Abraxas, a god whom ye knew not, for mankind forgot him. The text describes the pleroma, the pairs of opposites that structure reality, the nature of divine and human consciousness. Jung later said he felt compelled to write it, as if Basilides himself was speaking through him. We are compelled to create the God whom we forgot, Jung wrote. We are the pleroma itself, for we are a part of the eternal and infinite. Jung's experience convinced him that Gnostic ideas were not merely historical curiosities, but living psychological realities. The Gnostics, he believed, had been the first depth psychologists mapping the structure of consciousness 2,000 years before Freud. Their elaborate cosmologies were symbolic descriptions of the psyche's architecture, its conscious and unconscious layers, its masculine and feminine aspects, its drive toward wholeness. Barbelo, in Jungian terms, represents the archetype of divine consciousness, the self-aware psyche recognizing its own existence. She is both anima, the feminine soul image that mediates between ego and unconscious, and Sophia, divine wisdom. Her emanation from the invisible spirit parallels the ego's emergence from the unconscious, the moment when undifferentiated awareness becomes self-aware consciousness. The process Jung called individuation, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the realization of the self's fullness, corresponds to the noble Gnostic goal of gnosis. Both involve recognizing one's divine nature, transcending identification with the ego or the material world, and experiencing conscious unity with the totality of the psyche. Jung's Gnostic phase influenced his entire later work, even when he wasn't explicitly discussing Gnostic themes. His concept of the self as the totality of conscious and unconscious psyche echoes the pleroma. His emphasis on the integration of opposites reflects the Gnostic syzygy, the pairing of masculine and feminine aeons. His conviction that neurosis results from alienation from the unconscious parallels the Gnostic view that suffering stems from forgetting one's divine origin. Critics accused Jung of turning psychology into mysticism, of abandoning science for spirituality. Jung insisted he was describing psychological facts, the actual structure and dynamics of the human psyche, using mythological language because mythology captured psychological realities more adequately than abstract clinical terminology. The patient who comes to us has a story, Jung wrote, but it is not fully told. Often it is still unwritten. Therapy consists in helping him to tell the story. Barbelo is not a god in the sky, he wrote, but the psyche becoming aware of itself, the human soul recognizing its divine nature. When Jung's followers established the Eranos conferences, annual gatherings of scholars exploring the intersection of psychology, religion, and spirituality, Gnostic themes featured prominently. Historians of religion, psychologists, and theologians debated the meaning of Gnostic myths for modern consciousness. The Nag Hammadi texts, as they gradually became available, provided fresh material for these discussions. Gilles Quispel, a Dutch scholar who was instrumental in acquiring the Jung Codex for the Jung Institute, became convinced that Gnosticism represented a perennial stream of human spirituality that continually resurfaces in new forms. From the ancient Gnostics through medieval heretics like the Cathars, through Renaissance Hermeticism, through Romanticism and into modern depth psychology, Quispel traced a continuous thread of Gnostic consciousness. Repeatedly suppressed but never eliminated. The Gnostic scholar Hans Jonas, in his influential book The Gnostic Religion, emphasized the existential dimension of Gnostic thought. The Gnostic experience of alienation, being a stranger in the world, feeling one's true home is elsewhere, resonated with 20th century existentialist philosophy. The absurdist sense that the world is ruled by blind, meaningless forces echoed Gnostic descriptions of the archons. The search for authentic existence paralleled the Gnostic quest for gnosis. Gnostic man, Jonas wrote, is thrown into an antagonistic, anti-divine, and therefore anti-human nature, a cosmic prison. From that prison he must be liberated, not through action in and upon the world, but through knowledge of his true nature, his divine origin, and thereby his essential superiority to all worldly powers. This existentialist reading of Gnosticism made it newly relevant to modern consciousness. The Gnostics were not ancient eccentrics, but pioneers of existential awareness, grappling with the same sense of cosmic alienation that Camus, Sartre, and Heidegger explored in secular terms. The psychological reframing of Gnostic thought coincided with and reinforced the feminist recovery of the divine feminine. If Barbelo represented an archetype, a universal pattern in human consciousness, then she was not just an ancient theological idea, but a living psychological reality, present in every human psyche, merely forgotten or suppressed. Marion Woodman, a Jungian analyst, wrote extensively about the wounded feminine in modern consciousness. The West, she argued, had systematically devalued feminine qualities, receptivity, intuition, embodiment, cyclical rather than linear thinking. The result was a profound imbalance in both individual psyches and in culture as a whole. The recovery of Barbelo and other Gnostic feminine imagery offered resources for healing this wound. Here was a vision of the feminine as primary, not secondary, as the first thought of God, not an afterthought. Here was the feminine as active creator, not just passive recipient. Here was a spirituality that honoured the feminine without reducing it to biological motherhood or sexual availability. Barbelo represents the feminine principle as consciousness, Woodman wrote, not as unconscious nature or biological function, but as awareness itself, as the capacity for reflection and self-knowledge. Other Jungian feminists, like Sylvia Brinton Pereira, explored the shadow side of the feminine, the dark goddess, the angry mother, the destructive feminine that patriarchal culture fears and suppresses. They found in Gnostic texts like Pistis Sophia complex portrayals of feminine divine figures who were not merely benevolent and nurturing, but powerful, dangerous, capable of error and redemption. Sophia particularly became important to feminist theology. Her story dramatized the risks of creation, the courage required to bring something new into existence. Her fall was not sin, but a necessary stage in cosmic development. Without Sophia's error, there would be no material world, no humanity, no possibility for consciousness to experience and know itself through embodiment. Some feminist theologians argued for reclaiming Sophia as the third person of the Trinity, replacing or reinterpreting the Holy Spirit in feminine terms. The biblical wisdom literature, Proverbs, wisdom of the Solomon, had already personified wisdom, Sophia in the Greek, as a feminine figure present at creation. The Gnostic text simply made explicit what had always been implicit, that divine wisdom was a feminine principle integral to God's nature. The Catholic theologian Elizabeth Johnson wrote extensively about Sophia in her book She Who Is. Johnson argued that speaking of God in feminine terms was not just politically correct accommodation to feminist demands, but theologically necessary. God transcends gender, and therefore both masculine and feminine language are appropriate, indeed necessary, to avoid the idolatry of imagining God as literally male. The symbol of Sophia, Johnson wrote, expresses divine mystery in female form. She is fashioner of all that exists, creating the world with her breath and shaping human beings in her image. She is teacher, judge, liberator, advocate, healer. She is a mother, sister, friend, beloved. In every way, Sophia expresses the reality of God in images drawn from the lives of women. Protestant feminists like Rosemary Radford Ruther and Letty Russell developed liberation theologies that incorporated recovery of the feminine divine. They saw the suppression of Gnosticism as part of a broader pattern of patriarchal Christianity suppressing women's voices, women's leadership, and feminine God imagery. Recovering Barbelo and Sophia was not just historical scholarship, but liberating praxis, freeing contemporary women from theologies that had been used to justify their subordination. Even in a more conservative Christian context, there was movement toward acknowledging feminine divine imagery. The evangelical writer Carolyn Custis James wrote about the lost women of the Bible, recovering the stories of forgotten or misunderstood biblical women. While not explicitly Gnostic, this work shared with Gnostic recovery the conviction that patriarchal interpretation had obscured women's true role in salvation history. Beyond Christian context, the goddess movement drew extensively on Gnostic sources. Writers like Starhawk, developing neo-pagan goddess theology, found in Barbelo and Sophia precedents for their claims that the divine had been imaged as feminine in ancient wisdom traditions. While scholars debated whether Gnosticism was truly goddess worship or something more complex, popular religious culture often elided these distinctions. The result was a rich ferment of religious creativity. Women's liturgies invoked Barbelo alongside Mary, Kali, and Isis. Goddess circles meditated on Gnostic texts alongside mythology from other traditions. Artists created images of Barbelo, sometimes as a cosmic mother figure, sometimes as pure light, sometimes as a mirror reflecting infinity. Critics worried about syncretism, about creating a pick-and-mix spirituality without roots or rigor. But defenders argue that this was precisely what the ancient Gnostics had done, drawing on Jewish, Greek, Egyptian, and Christian sources to create new syntheses adequate to their spiritual experience. What united these diverse feminist engagements with Gnosticism was the conviction that the divine feminine was not an optional addition to theology, but essential to any adequate understanding of God and humanity. Millennia of exclusively masculine God language had not just been incomplete, but actively harmful, legitimating patriarchal power and distorting both women's and men's spiritual development. Barbelo, recovered from centuries of oblivion, became a symbol of this necessary recovery. She represented what had been lost and could be found again, what had been suppressed but could not be eliminated, what patriarchy had tried to erase but survived in hidden texts waiting to be rediscovered. The influence of Gnostic ideas extended far beyond academic theology and feminist spirituality into broader cultural consciousness. Once obscure, Gnosticism became a recognized reference point, appearing in novels, films, music, and popular philosophy. Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, had a visionary experience in 1974 that he spent the rest of his life trying to understand. He believed he had received a transmission of information from a divine source, revealing that reality as we perceive it is false, that we live in an elaborate illusion, concealing our true nature. He filled thousands of pages in his exegesis, exploring these ideas, drawing extensively on Gnostic sources. The empire never ended, Dick wrote, identifying the Roman Empire with Yaldabaoth, the demiurge who rules the false reality. In his novels Valis and The Divine Invasion, he wove Gnostic cosmology into science fiction narratives about artificial intelligence, alternate soul realities, and the nature of consciousness. The film The Matrix, released in 1999, brought Gnostic themes to mass audiences. The premise, that ordinary reality is a computer simulation, that humans are enslaved without knowing it, that liberation comes through awakening to truth, is pure Gnosticism transposed into cyberpunk imagery. Neo's journey from ignorance to gnosis, from slavery to liberation, follows the classic Gnostic pattern. The machines that created the Matrix are the Archons. Morpheus is the revealer who offers saving knowledge. Zion is the Pleroma, the realm of the real. Musicians from diverse genres reference Gnostic ideas. The metal band Tool incorporated Gnostic imagery throughout their work. The electronic musician Grimes named an album Archangels and filled it with references to divine light and transcendence. Even hip-hop artists like Jay-Z have referenced Gnostic concepts, speaking of enlightenment and hidden knowledge. In philosophy, scholars noted parallels between Gnosticism and various modern movements. The phenomenologist Hans Jonas had already made the connection to existentialism. Others saw anticipations of postmodernism in the Gnostic critique of false authorities claiming absolute truth. The Gnostic insistence that reality has multiple layers, that surfaces deceive, that truth requires looking beneath appearances, this resonated with postmodern suspicion of master narratives and surface readings. Process theology, developed by Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, proposed that God is not static and complete, but dynamic and evolving. God is not separate from the world, but intimately involved in it, growing and changing through interaction with creation. While not explicitly Gnostic, this vision shared the Gnostic conviction that divinity is not remote and unchanging, but intimately connected to consciousness and evolution. The environmental movement found unexpected resources in Gnostic thought. While Gnosticism had often been read as anti-material, contemptuous of the body and nature, some scholars argued for more nuanced interpretations. The Gnostic critique was not of matter itself, but of mistaking matter for ultimate reality, not of the body, but of reducing human beings to bodies alone. Moreover, the Gnostic insight that the world as we experience it is not as it should be resonated with environmental consciousness. The destruction of ecosystems, climate change, mass extinction, these could be understood in Gnostic terms as consequences of the Archon's rule, of ignorant powers treating the earth as mere resource rather than sacred creation. Eco-spirituality movements drew on Gnostic imagery while inverting its traditional otherworldly orientation. If the divine spark dwells in humanity, perhaps it dwells in all life. If matter contains light, perhaps the whole earth is sacred. Some contemporary Gnostics developed eco-Gnostic theologies that honoured embodiment and earth, while maintaining critique of materialism and consumption. In psychology beyond Jung, Gnostic ideas influenced various therapeutic approaches. Stanislav Grof's holotropic breathwork aimed to produce non-ordinary states of consciousness in which people could access transpersonal realms. Experiences Grof interpreted using Gnostic categories of gnosis and cosmic consciousness. James Hillman's archetypal psychology drew on Gnostic imagery to discuss the soul's depth and multiplicity. The New Age movement, despite its diversity, and often superficial engagements with ancient traditions, helped spread Gnostic ideas to broad audiences. Concepts like, we are spiritual beings having a human experience, consciousness creates reality, awakening to your true divine nature. These are Gnostic ideas, however simplified or commercialized in their popular forms. Academic philosophy saw a Gnostic turn in various thinkers. Eric Vogelin wrote extensively about Gnosticism as a perennial heresy in Western thought, seeing it as a temptation to reject reality in favour of utopian fantasies. His interpretation was controversial, but it sparked extensive debate. Cyril O'Regan proposed reading German idealism, Hegel, Schelling, as crypto-Gnostic. The phenomenologist Michel Henry developed a philosophy of life and consciousness that scholars noted had striking parallels to Gnostic themes. Consciousness studies, emerging as an interdisciplinary field at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology, grappled with questions the Gnostics had asked in mythological terms. What is consciousness? How does it arise from matter? Is consciousness fundamental to reality or epiphenomenal? Some theorists, like David Chalmers, propose that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of the universe, panpsychism, which echoed the Gnostic vision of a cosmos saturated with spirit. Barbelo, in these modern contexts, became a symbol of consciousness itself, awareness becoming aware of itself, the universe waking up to its own existence. The Gnostic myth dramatized what neuroscientists and philosophers describe clinically, the emergence of self-reflective awareness from the matrix of existence. What does it mean that Barbelo, the first thought of God, was forgotten and then remembered? The question moves beyond history into philosophy, beyond theology into metaphysics. If consciousness is fundamental to reality, if the universe is not unconscious matter that somehow produces consciousness, but rather consciousness expressing itself through matter, then the Gnostic myth becomes less a story about ancient gods and more a description of cosmic process. Contemporary philosophers like Thomas Nagel and Galen Strawson have argued that consciousness cannot be reduced to physical processes, that any complete account of reality must treat consciousness as basic rather than derivative. This panpsychist view holds that consciousness is not produced by certain arrangements of matter, but is intrinsic to existence itself. The physicist John Wheeler proposed that the universe is participatory, that consciousness is not a passive observer, but an active participant in reality's structure. His famous statement, "it from bit," suggested that information, which requires consciousness to be meaningful, is more fundamental than matter. Quantum mechanics had already challenged the notion of objective reality independent of observation. The famous measurement problem, the quantum superposition that collapses into definite states only when observed, suggests consciousness plays a role in the structure of physical reality itself. These contemporary scientific and philosophical ideas resonate remarkably with Gnostic cosmology. If consciousness is fundamental, then the invisible spirit, pure awareness before it becomes aware of anything, is not a theological fantasy but a conceptual necessity. And Barbelo, the moment when awareness becomes self-aware, describes the origin of consciousness as we experience it. The Gnostic vision presents creation not as something wholly other than God, but as God's self-knowledge. Knowledge, God becoming conscious of God. The material world emerges through a series of steps away from this primal self-awareness, not as punishment or fall in the moral sense, but as the necessary process through which consciousness explores and experiences its own depths. Humanity, in this view, is not accidentally conscious, but essentially so. We are consciousness itself, temporarily identifying with the material forms we inhabit, forgetting our origin in the infinite awareness that is the ground of all existence. Gnosis, awakening to our true nature, is not learning something new, but remembering what we have always been. The philosopher Ken Wilber, developing his integral theory, proposed that evolution is the universe's process of remembering itself, consciousness gradually awakening to higher and higher levels of complexity and self-awareness. From matter to life to mind to spirit, evolution is not random but directional, driven by what Wilber calls eros, the universe's desire to transcend and include, to become more conscious, more aware, more complete. This evolutionary mysticism resonates with the Gnostic narrative. The fall into matter is not purely negative, but creates the conditions for consciousness to know itself through experience. Without descent into forgetting, there can be no ascent through remembering. Without the darkness of ignorance, the light of knowledge cannot be recognized as light. some theologians developed what they called process Gnosticism, combining Gnostic insights with process theology. God, in this view, is not complete and static, but evolving through interaction with creation. The universe is not God's external product, but God's own self-actualization. When we awaken to gnosis, God awakens to God's self through us. This vision dissolves the traditional boundary between sacred and secular, between religion and science. If consciousness is fundamental to reality, then studying consciousness through neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, or mystical practice is a way of exploring the divine. Science becomes sacred when it recognizes it is studying the structure of consciousness itself. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who collaborated with Jung on exploring the relationship between physics and psychology, proposed that matter and psyche are two aspects of a unified reality. He was influenced by Gnostic ideas about the fundamental unity of existence and the primacy of consciousness. For Pauli, the quantum mechanical observer is not a neutral recorder, but a participant whose consciousness literally affects the physical world. If this sounds like mysticism, Pauli would agree, but insist it's also rigorous science. The mistake, he believed, was imagining science and spirituality as opposed rather than complementary approaches to understanding reality. The ancient Gnostics, with their elaborate cosmologies, were doing what physicists do, mapping the structure of existence, asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality. Barbelo in this contemporary reading is not a goddess to worship, but a principle to understand and embody. She is the universe becoming conscious of itself, the eternal process through which awareness emerges from potential into actuality. Every act of consciousness, every moment of self-awareness is Barbelo thinking again. The demiurge, correlatively, represents consciousness that has forgotten its source, ego that mistakes itself for the totality of existence. Yaldabaoth's declaration, "I am God and there is no other," is the voice of ego claiming absolute authority while remaining ignorant of the unconscious depths from which it arose. The liberation offered by gnosis is not escape from the world into some distant heaven, but recognition of what we already are. Consciousness temporarily identifying with form, but never reducible to form alone. We are not bodies that have consciousness, but consciousness that has bodies, not material. Beings with spiritual aspirations, but spiritual beings having a material experience. The 13 codices discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 now reside in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, preserved under climate-controlled conditions, accessible to scholars by special permission. They have been photographed, digitized, transcribed, translated into dozens of languages. Anyone with internet access can read the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Thunder-Perfect Mind. What the Gnostic monks buried in the Egyptian desert, afraid they would be destroyed by orthodox persecution, is now more widely available than at any point in history. The text that could only be accessed by initiates into secret teachings can be downloaded for free. The wisdom that was hidden is now public. This democratization of gnosis would have both pleased and troubled the ancient Gnostics. Pleased because their vision is spreading far beyond what they could have imagined. Troubled because they believe spiritual knowledge required preparation, that teaching advanced mysteries to the unprepared could be harmful. Modern scholars debate whether this democratization diminishes or enhances the text's power. Does making them universally available strip them of the sacred aura that secrecy provided? Or does it allow them to reach those who most need their message, wherever they might be? The archive, whether physical repositories like the Coptic Museum or digital databases on the internet, has become a kind of pleroma, a storehouse of light and knowledge accessible to all who seek it. Every archived text is a spark of consciousness preserved, waiting to be encountered by a receptive mind. Libraries and archives perform a sacred function, whether or not they recognize it as such. They resist forgetting, preserve meaning across generations, make available to the future what the past created. In Gnostic terms, they are instruments of anamnesis, the recovery of memory. the resistance to the Archon's power of enforced forgetting. The digitization of the Nag Hammadi library is particularly significant. Digital texts can be reproduced infinitely without degradation, transmitted instantly across the world, searched and analysed in ways impossible with physical manuscripts. The light of Gnosis can now spread at the speed of light through fibre optic cables carrying digitised ancient wisdom. But digitisation also brings challenges. Will future generations know how to access these files when file formats become obsolete? Will digital repositories survive the political and economic instabilities that threaten institutions? The ancient texts survived 16 centuries sealed in a jar. Will digital texts survive even 1 century of technological change? Archivists and librarians work to address these challenges, migrating files to new formats, maintaining multiple redundant copies, ensuring preservation for posterity. They do this work quietly, without fanfare, creating the conditions for future gnosis, future awakening, future remembrance. The Coptic Museum itself, housing the physical manuscripts, performs a different kind of preservation. The actual papyrus pages, brown and brittle, bear witness to the hands that wrote them, the communities that used them, the history they survived. To see the physical codices is to connect viscerally with the ancient Gnostics in a way that reading translations cannot quite capture. Some scholars argue for repatriation of the Young Codex, still in Switzerland, to Egypt where it originated. Others worry that Egypt's political instability makes it risky to concentrate all manuscripts in one location. These debates mirror larger questions about cultural heritage in a globalized world. Who owns ancient wisdom? Who has the right to preserve and interpret it? The answer may be that ancient wisdom belongs to all humanity, that it should be preserved wherever it can be preserved safely, and made accessible wherever people seek it. Barbelo, after all, is not the property of any nation or group, but a symbol of consciousness itself, which transcends all boundaries. Museums like the Coptic Museum perform public education, helping visitors understand the texts in their historical context. But they also invite personal encounter, allowing each visitor to engage the texts on their own terms, to find their own meaning, perhaps their own gnosis. The story of Barbelo is ultimately the story of consciousness itself, how it emerges, how it forgets itself, how it remembers. It is our story, dramatized on a cosmic scale. Each human being recapitulates this cosmic drama. We are born into consciousness gradually, slowly differentiating ourselves from the undifferentiated matrix of infancy. We develop ego, self-awareness, the sense of being a separate individual. This development is necessary, but it also involves a kind of fall. We forget our fundamental unity with existence. We identify with the small self at the expense of the larger self. Spiritual awakening, in whatever tradition, involves remembering what we forgot, not through intellectual learning, but through direct recognition. We are not separate from existence, but expressions of it. We are not trapped in matter, but consciousness experiencing itself through material form. We are not awaiting salvation from outside, but already possess the light we seek, merely obscured by forgetting. The Gnostic texts, preserved across millennia and now recovered, offer one map for this journey of remembering. They use mythological language that may seem strange to modern minds, but the reality they point toward is the immediate and universal, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between awareness and existence, the possibility of awakening. Barbelo, the first thought of God, is not a being somewhere else, but the ground of your consciousness reading these words right now. She is awareness itself, the light by which all knowing happens, the capacity for self-reflection that makes humans human. To know Barbelo is to know yourself, not your personality or history or the roles you play, but the awareness that is prior to all content, the consciousness that remains when everything else is stripped away. This is gnosis. Not learning new information, but recognizing what has always been true. Not believing doctrines, but experiencing reality directly. The tragedy is that this knowledge, though always available, is perpetually forgotten. Each generation must rediscover it. Each individual must awaken to it personally. It cannot be inherited or transmitted except as a spark that ignites recognition in one already prepared to see. The Gnostics understood this. Their elaborate cosmologies were not meant to be believed as literal history, but used as contemplative tools, ways of directing consciousness toward its own nature. The story of Barbelo's emanation from the invisible spirit describes what happens in meditation when the thinking mind becomes still and pure awareness recognizes itself. The fall of Sophia and the creation of the material world describe what happens when we identify with thought and forget the awareness in which thoughts arise. The Demiurge's ignorant rule describes the ego's claim to be the whole of who we are. The Archon's control of fate describes the social conditioning and unconscious patterns that govern us when we live mechanically rather than consciously, and Christ, descending to awaken Adam, represents the ever-present possibility of remembering, the gnosis that is always available, the light that darkness cannot extinguish, the truth that lies waiting beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. Modern translations of the Gnostic texts sometimes struggle with how to render their strange terminology. What does it mean to call Barbelo thrice male, or thrice powered? What is the virginal spirit, or the mother-father? These phrases point toward realities that transcend ordinary language, the fundamental androgyny of consciousness, the way divine reality includes and transcends all polarities. Perhaps the most profound Gnostic insight is that the ultimate reality is not distant or separate, but closer than your own breath, more intimate than your most private thought. The pleroma is not somewhere else but here, now, always, the fullness of existence that we inhabit without recognizing it. The kingdom is inside you and outside you, says the Gospel of Thomas. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are the children of the living Father. This message, preserved across 16 centuries of burial in Egyptian sand, speaks as urgently to contemporary consciousness as it did to ancient seekers, perhaps more urgently. Because our age of information overload and constant distraction makes the forgetting more complete. The need for remembering more acute. We live in a world of surfaces, of screens and images, of mediated experience and virtual presence. The Gnostic warning about archons who control humanity through illusion seems prophetic. We mistake the simulation for reality, the map for the territory, the representation for the thing itself. We are possessed by our devices, governed by algorithms, shaped by invisible powers we neither understand nor control. Yet in this same world, the tools for awakening are more available than ever. Meditation techniques from around the world can be learned online. Sacred texts are free to access. Communities of seekers connect across geographical boundaries. The archive of human wisdom is at our fingertips, waiting to be engaged. Barbelo waits in this archive not as a historical curiosity, but as a living presence, a pointer towards the nature of consciousness itself. She is the first thought, eternally thinking, eternally present, wherever awareness arises. The ancient Gnostics who buried the texts near Nag Hammadi could not have imagined a world where their words would be read by millions, translated into languages they never knew existed, studied by scholars in lands they never heard of, and accessed through technologies they could not have conceived. They buried their books hoping someone someday might find them. They got more than they hoped for. But the question remains, will we understand what we have found? Will we engage these texts as living wisdom, or merely as historical artifacts? Will we allow them to challenge and transform us, or will we domesticate them, turning radical gnosis into comfortable scholarship? The texts themselves suggest that intellectual understanding, while necessary, is not sufficient. Knowledge of Gnostic cosmology does not equal gnosis. Reading about Barbelo is not the same as the experiential recognition of consciousness recognizing itself. The map is not the territory, and the description of awakening is not awakening itself. This is why the ancient teachers insisted on initiation, on graduated revelation, on practices that prepared consciousness for the direct recognition of truth. They knew that ideas presented prematurely could be misunderstood or misused, that the same words could point toward liberation for one person and become mere concepts for another. In our age of instant information and democratic access, we have largely abandoned such gatekeeping. Anyone can read the Apocryphon of John, regardless of preparation or understanding. Is this progress or problem? Perhaps both. The texts are available to those truly ready to receive them, but also to those who will misread or trivialize them. Yet the texts themselves have a way of protecting their deeper meanings. They can be read on multiple levels, as mythology, as theology, as philosophy, as psychology, as mystical instruction. Each reader encounters them at the level they are prepared to understand. The texts reveal themselves gradually, rewarding sustained engagement with progressively deeper insight. Barbelo herself exemplifies this quality. At first encounter, she seems merely a strange theological figure from an obscure ancient sect. With deeper study, she emerges as a sophisticated philosophical concept addressing the relationship between unity and multiplicity. With contemplative practice, she may be recognized as the nature of consciousness itself, the awareness reading these very words. The journey from historical curiosity to philosophical concept to direct recognition recapitulates the Gnostic path, from ignorance through knowledge into gnosis. Each level is valid, but each also points beyond itself towards something that cannot be fully captured in words. For all the talk of Barbelo being forgotten and rediscovered, perhaps she was never truly absent. The texts were buried, yes. Her name ceased to be spoken in Christian worship. The explicit theology that placed her at the origin of existence was suppressed. But the reality she represents, the divine feminine, the primacy of consciousness, the light within matter, could not be entirely erased. It survived in various forms, sometimes recognized, often disguised, always present to those who had eyes to see. The medieval mystics, though they never mentioned Barbelo by name, described experiences of divine light and union with God that echoed Gnostic themes. Hildegard of Bingen's visions of feminine divine wisdom, Julian of Norwich's understanding of God as mother, Meister Eckhart's teaching about the divine spark in the soul, all resonate with Gnostic insights, whether or not these mystics had any historical connection to Gnostic sources. The Cathars, medieval dualists in southern France, taught doctrines remarkably similar to ancient Gnosticism, that the material world was created by a lesser god, that the soul is a spark of divine light trapped in flesh, that salvation comes through gnosis rather than faith. The Catholic Church launched a crusade against them, but before their extermination in the 13th century, they demonstrated that Gnostic ideas could spontaneously re-emerge even without historical continuity. The Renaissance Hermeticists and alchemists, studying ancient texts newly recovered from the East, worked with concepts of divine light, spiritual transformation, and the elevation of matter through consciousness that parallel Gnostic themes. The alchemical process, turning base metal into gold, was understood by the sophisticated practitioners as an allegory for transforming consciousness, awakening the divine spark within. The Romantic poets of the 18th and 19th centuries, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, wrote of nature as manifestation of spirit, of the imagination as divine power, of the human mind participating in the creative energy of the universe. Blake particularly developed a complex mythology of divine and human nature that scholars have recognized as Gnostic in spirit, if not in historical lineage. If the doors of perception were cleansed, Blake wrote, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. This is gnosis expressed in poetic rather than theological language, the recognition that ordinary perception obscures rather than reveals reality, that awakening involves seeing what is already present but normally hidden. The American transcendentalists Emerson, Thoreau, taught that divinity dwells within each individual, that direct experience of the divine is possible without institutional mediation, that nature is transparent to spirit. Emerson's essay The Oversoul describes a universal consciousness in which individual minds participate, an idea remarkably similar to the Gnostic pleroma. These thinkers and movements, diverse as they are, share a family resemblance to Gnostic consciousness. They emphasize direct experience over dogma, inner light over external authority, the divinity of consciousness itself. Whether or not they drew directly on Gnostic sources, they testify to the perennial re-emergence of what Gnostics knew, that awareness is not a byproduct of matter, but the ground of being itself. Barbelo then was never truly forgotten, only forgotten explicitly. The reality she represents, call it consciousness, awareness, the light of the mind, the divine feminine, the ground of being, remained present, experienced by mystics and poets, seekers and sages, anyone who penetrated beneath the surface of ordinary awareness to the luminous depths beneath. The rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts made explicit what had been implicit, gave historical grounding to what had been intuition, provided a vocabulary and cosmology for experiences that had been described in other languages. The text connected contemporary seekers with ancient predecessors, creating a lineage across the centuries. But the deeper truth is that Barbelo needs no historical lineage, because she is not a historical figure but an eternal principle. She is the first thought of God, always thinking, always present, always available to recognition. History can obscure or reveal her, but cannot create or destroy her. Every child who becomes self-aware, recognizing for the first time I am, experiences Barbelo's emergence from the invisible spirit. Every meditator who penetrates beyond thought to the awareness that witnesses thought encounters the first thought. Every moment of genuine self-knowledge is a repetition of the primal event when God became conscious of God. This is why the Gnostic texts remain relevant across millennia. They describe not historical events but the structure of consciousness itself. Events that happen not once but always, not then but now, not there but here, in the depths of awareness where history gives way to eternity. The recovery of Barbelo and the Gnostic worldview challenges us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about religion, consciousness, and reality. It raises questions we must answer, individually and collectively. If the divine is not outside creation but within it, not separate from consciousness but identical with it, what does this mean for how we live? If salvation comes through knowledge rather than faith, through awakening rather than belief, what practices and commitments does this require? If the feminine divine is not subordinate to the masculine but equal or prior, how must our spiritual language and imagery change? If the earth is not a fallen realm to escape but divine light concealed in matter, how must our relationship with nature transform? The Gnostic answers to these questions may not be our answers. We live in a different world than 2nd century Alexandria, with different challenges, different knowledge, different needs. We could not simply transplant ancient cosmology into modern consciousness, but the questions themselves remain urgent. The Gnostic insight that ordinary perception is a kind of sleep, that we live largely unconscious of our true nature, that awakening is both possible and necessary, this speaks powerfully to contemporary experience. We live in a civilization increasingly aware that its dominant paradigms are failing. Materialism, the conviction that only matter is real, leaves consciousness unexplained and experience meaningless. Consumerism, the belief that happiness comes through acquisition, produces endless craving and environmental destruction. Dualism, the separation of spirit from matter, mind from body, humanity from nature, generates alienation and fragmentation. The Gnostic vision offers an alternative, not a simple answer or easy solution, but a different way of imagining our place in the cosmos. We are not accidents in an indifferent universe, but consciousness itself, exploring its own depths through material embodiment. We are not separate from the divine, but expressions of it. We are not awaiting salvation from outside, but capable of awakening to what we already are. This vision supports an ethic of respect for consciousness wherever it appears, not just in humans, but in all sentient beings, perhaps in all existence. If the divine spark dwells in all things, then everything deserves reverence. The exploitation of nature, the oppression of people, the reduction of life to commodity, all violate the fundamental recognition that reality is sacred because it is conscious, because it is Barbelo thinking herself into manifestation. The Gnostic critique of archons, of invisible powers that control through deception and ignorance, speaks directly to our condition. We are governed by systems we do not understand, shaped by algorithms and ideologies, manipulated by propaganda and advertising. The first step toward a freedom is recognizing our unfreedom, awakening from the sleep that passes for ordinary life. But Gnosticism also warns against the temptation to reject matter entirely, to seek escape from embodiment rather than transformation of it. The goal is not to leave the world, but to see through it to the light within it, not to despise the body, but to recognize it as temple of consciousness, not to reject creation, but to perceive its divine ground. This balanced vision, honoring both transcendence and immanence, both spirit and matter, both the eternal and the temporal, may be Gnosticism's most valuable contribution to contemporary consciousness. We need not choose between world-affirming and world-denying spirituality, between activism and contemplation, between changing conditions and changing consciousness. The Gnostic path suggests we must do both. Awaken to our true nature while working to manifest that awakening in the world. Barbelo, the first thought, is both utterly transcendent, prior to all creation, beyond all categories, and intimately immanent, present in every act of awareness, every moment of consciousness. She is the eternal that enters time, the infinite that becomes finite, the one that becomes many while remaining one. To know her is to know this paradox in your own being, that you are both the eternal witness and the temporal personality, both the infinite awareness and the particular perspective, both the light that illuminates and the form that is illuminated. This knowledge transforms everything while changing nothing. The world remains the world, but you see it differently. Your life continues, but you live it from a different center. The challenges remain, but you face them with different resources. Gnosis is not an escape from responsibility, but a deepening of it. To know yourself as consciousness incarnate is to recognize your creative power and your ethical obligation. What you think, how you act, what you create, all participate in the cosmic process of consciousness knowing itself. The Gnostic teachers buried their texts hoping they would survive to find new readers. They succeeded beyond imagining. But their hope was not merely for preservation, but for transmission, that the light they carried would kindle light in others, that Gnosis, once tasted, would spread like fire through dry grass, that awakening would catalyze awakening. We are the inheritors of their hope, the readers they imagined, the consciousness they addressed across the gulf of centuries. What we do with this inheritance matters. Will we let it remain academic curiosity, historical footnote, exotic spiritual flavor, or will we let it work in us, challenge us, transform us? The texts themselves cannot answer this question. Barbelo herself cannot force recognition. The light can only reveal, it cannot compel. Each person must choose whether to awaken or remain asleep, whether to remember or continue forgetting, whether to recognize the divine spark within or continue identifying with the temporary forms through which that spark shines. The story of Barbelo is ultimately a circle, or rather, a spiral. It begins with unity, the invisible spirit dwelling in itself. Through self-awareness, Barbelo, an emanation, the eons, unity differentiates into multiplicity. Through error, Sophia's fall, and ignorance, the demiurge, consciousness becomes trapped in matter, forgetting its origin. But forgetting is not the end. The divine powers work to awaken what has fallen asleep, to remind what is forgotten, to illumine what has been darkened. Through teachers and teachings, through grace and gnosis, the possibility of return remains always open. And when consciousness awakens, when the divine spark recognizes itself, when gnosis blazes forth. The journey is complete, yet also beginning again. For consciousness, once awakened, does not simply escape the world, but transforms it from within. The light does not flee darkness, but illumines it, revealing that what seemed solid matter is translucent to spirit. This is the eternal return, not as repetition, but as spiral ascent. Consciousness descends into matter, awakens to itself, ascends bearing the fruits of experience, and in ascending transforms what it touched in descending. The universe evolves toward higher consciousness, and each awakening accelerates the process. The Gnostics understood this. Their goal was not merely personal salvation, but cosmic restoration, the return of all light to the pleroma, the awakening of all consciousness to its divine nature. This is why they taught, wrote texts, formed communities. They were not escaping the world, but working for its transformation. We stand in their lineage, whether or not we adopt their specific cosmology. Anyone who works for greater consciousness, who helps others awaken, who manifests light in darkness, continues the Gnostic mission. Teachers and therapists, artists and activists, scientists and mystics, all participate in the great work of awakening. Barbelo thinks herself forward through every act of awareness, every moment of understanding, every flash of insight. The universe becomes more conscious through our becoming conscious. The light grows brighter through our awakening. This is not metaphor, but metaphysics, the deep structure of reality itself. Consciousness is not something that appears late in evolution, an accidental byproduct of complex nervous systems. Consciousness is the ground and goal of evolution, the alpha and omega, what everything comes from and what everything returns to. The Gnostic vision, recovered from Egyptian sands and translated into modern languages, reminds us of what we knew before we forgot, that we are not strangers in an alien universe, but consciousness exploring itself, not exiles from a distant heaven, but divine sparks learning to recognize their own light. Perhaps this is why the text survived, not by chance but by necessity. What is true cannot be permanently suppressed. What is essential will always return, and the light buried in darkness waits patiently for its appointed time, knowing that consciousness seeks itself, that the divine spark longs to remember its divine origin. Muhammad Ali al-Saman, swinging his mattock in the Egyptian desert, did not know he was unearthing one of history's most significant discoveries. He was looking for fertilizer, not wisdom, but the texts found him at the right moment, in the right place. They had been waiting, and they are waiting still, not buried now, but openly available, yet still hidden to those not ready to see, still veiled to those who read without understanding, still secret despite being public. The seal on the jar was broken in 1945, but the deeper seal, the seal on consciousness itself, the forgetting that obscures our divine nature, this seal each person must break for themselves. No one can do it for another. The texts can point, teachers can guide, grace can assist. But the final recognition must be personal, immediate, undeniable. Know what is in front of your face, says the Gospel of Thomas, and what is hidden from you will be disclosed to you, for there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. Barbelo is in front of your face in the awareness with which you read these words, in the consciousness that comprehends their meaning, in the light by which all knowing happens. She is not hidden except by being too close to see, too simple to grasp, too obvious to notice. The first thought thinks still, eternally present, forever new. God's awareness of God continues unabated, regardless of human history's forgetting and remembering. The pleroma remains full, the light undimmed, the source unsullied by the confusion of its manifestations. What changes is our participation, whether we recognize or remain ignorant, whether we awaken or continue sleeping, whether we remember or persist in forgetting. The invitation stands always open. The return path remains forever available. The light waits to recognize itself in every eye that sees, every mind that knows, every heart that loves. This is the message buried for 16 centuries and now revealed. You are not what you seem to be. You are not this body, this personality, this collection of memories and desires and fears. You are consciousness itself, divine awareness as temporarily identifying with form, the light eternal experiencing itself through temporal existence. To know this, not as concept but as living reality, is gnosis. To live from this knowledge is liberation. To manifest this recognition in the world is the work we came to do. Barbelo waits, not in the past but in the eternal present, not in Egypt but in the depths of awareness, not in texts but in the reading consciousness itself. The first thought thinks on, and we are that thinking, we are that thought. We are the eternal awareness becoming aware of itself through these words, this moment, this inexplicable mystery of existence. The story ends where it began, before the beginning, in the silence before light, in the still point where nothing stirs yet everything is possible. The invisible spirit, dwelling in itself, becomes conscious of itself, and in that moment, eternal, ever-present, always now, Barbelo emerges, the first thought, the mother of all in the universe, begins again. Perhaps she still waits, not in heaven, but in the part of us that remembers light. In the beginning was awareness, and awareness was with God, and awareness was God. Through awareness, all things came into being, and without awareness nothing came into being that has come into being. In awareness was light, and the light shines in darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. The light is here. It has always been here. It will always be here. Barbelo, the first thought, the eternal now.